นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Good evening from cold, wintry Bodhiwana Monastery on the edge of Melbourne in the mountains. It's now officially winter and it feels like it. I actually just returned from a trip overseas to Thailand and Europe, where of course it's summer, being the opposite of Australia. Thailand was very hot, and even the UK, where I went to visit my relatives and also the monasteries there, that was also warm when I was there, although it's not always warm. The occasion of the visit to the UK was mainly to join in the 90th birthday celebration for Lumpur Sumedho, who is was the first foreign monk to go and live with our teacher, Lumpur Cha, back in around 1967, so a long time ago now. And he's somebody who has made a great contribution to Buddhist monasticism and the spreading of Buddhist teachings, the Dhamma, around the world. I myself have known him since before I was a monk. I travelled to Thailand to find a teacher, and I went to stay with Ajahn Chah. Decided to become a Buddhist monk with him back in the early 1980s. But before I began training, I returned to the UK to settle my business, as it were, tell my parents that I was going to ordain and get rid of my possessions and everything. So during that time when I returned to England, I found out that there was a monastery, the first branch monastery of Ajahn Chah overseas, a monastery called Chithurst Buddhist Monastery, or Chitta Viveka, which means like the secluded mind, which is where Lumpur Sumedho, or Ajahn Sumedho in those days, lived at that time. And by travelling back this time to joining his 90th birthday, it was an opportunity to hear a lot of reflections and recollections of his life as a monk in Thailand and then later particularly in the UK, but also teaching around the world. So hearing his own reflections, because he's still a very active teacher, even though he's 90 years old, and the reflections of his friends and students, other monks and nuns who have studied and lived with him over the years. And most of the talks you can hear online as well. But it was a time to, I guess, celebrate his life, his contribution to Buddhism, his own practice, and his mind is still very bright and radiant. There's one interesting story about how when he first went to England with Lumpur Cha in 1977, he wasn't yet really planning to build a monastery and stay for the rest of his life in England. He was more travelling as the assistant and translator for Lumpur Cha to teach the Buddhists of England who had invited them over. But during that visit, which was an extended visit of several months, he was with Ajahn Chah, and at one point we found out later Ajahn Chah had a vision in his meditation where he saw this old garden or orchard that had had big, beautiful fruit trees, apple trees, whatever, but had become overgrown, covered with vines and weeds. And then a gardener came along and cleared away the vines and weeds and re-established that orchard into a thriving, beautiful place. And his interpretation of that vision that came up in his meditation was that England was ripe for the Dhamma, and even though it was an old culture, people have been living in the island of the UK, the British Isles, for centuries, but there was a certain ripeness or readiness to receive the Dhamma. So he decided to leave the younger Lumpur Sumedho there to serve the community and possibly build a monastery, and he felt he would be successful in that task. And he wrote this down in his diary, which he kept, but he didn't actually explain that to Lumpur Sumedho at the time. He just went into his diary, which was later read, and we still have Lumpur Cha's diary of that event, that trip. Well, Lumpur Sumedho himself didn't know Ajahn Chah had had this vision. He just knew that Ajahn Chah said, "Oh, you can stay here." And so he said his initial reaction was he felt abandoned by his teacher, not knowing how confident Lumpur Cha was that he would do well in Britain and the British people would do well with Buddhism. So it's a great unknown. But that's part of our life, following the Buddhist path. Nobody knows what your future holds for you. We like to predict and plan. We like to control our lives in the world on every level, but nobody really knows, because the future, as Lumpur Sumedho used to say, and when I first met him as a layman, he used to begin his Dhamma talks on retreats with that phrase, "The past is just a memory, the future is unknown, now is the knowing." And that's the main quality we're developing in our practice always, is to come back to the present moment and know what's going on in your mind, your body, as it is, with mindfulness, with insight, in the present moment. So the future is the unknown. We don't know what's going to happen in our own personal lives or the world, or what's going to happen to Buddhism, Buddhist monasteries. And at that time, you can imagine for Lumpur Sumedho, he really didn't know how well Buddhism would do in the UK, whether they'd be able to build a monastery and survive. So he was full of doubts, and he expressed that to Lumpur Cha. Lumpur Cha just said, "No, you just get on with it," in the kind of practical, down-to-earth way Ajahn Chah could have with his monks, his students. And Ajahn Sumedho already had a foundation. He'd been practicing for about 10 years as a monk. He began Wat Panana Chat, the international forest monastery near Ajahn Chah's monastery in Thailand. So he had some experience as teaching, leading a community already. And Ajahn Chah said, "Well, you can lead the community here." And then went back to Thailand. So from that beginning, humble beginning, one monastery, Chithurst Monastery began, and then Amravati Monastery, where the event that I just joined 2 weeks ago was held, that began. And gradually many monasteries have sprung up in the UK, Europe, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and around the world, and they keep growing up. The Sangha keeps expanding. And certainly the initial period, a lot of that was due to Lumpur Sumedho's strength of practice, his wisdom, his kindness and compassion, his peace of mind and clarity in guiding communities, giving teachings, leading meditation retreats, and so on. So everybody is very grateful for his contribution, his practice, his life as a student of Ajahn Chah, and then in teaching Buddhism around the world. And so that was expressed 2 weeks ago in Amravati Monastery, where I went, and about 140 monks, 20, 30 nuns, about 1,500 lay people all joined for the day and had a very pleasant, happy time. Even though the content of many of the talks was the subject of dukkha, suffering, which is one of those strange things, isn't it? Buddhists love to talk about suffering, but they talk about it with a smile and a sense of humour. And that certainly came out as we were listening to Lumpur Sumedho himself and other monks who have lived with him for 40, 50 years, some of them, both Thai monks and foreign Western monks. Everyone could look back on their life in the monkhood with a certain smile, sense of humour, and many people had shared stories of how they suffered either in the Thai jungle or in the early monasteries of the UK, where things could be quite difficult conditions. And indeed, any Buddhist monastery always begins from very simple, humble beginnings, and whoever lives there, the monks, the nuns, the Sangha, will always have to have a certain patience and endurance to deal with the difficulties of living as a Buddhist monk, particularly in a non-Buddhist country like UK or anywhere else around the world outside of Asia. So it's quite a good reminder to hear some of these stories and reflections. As I said, a lot of it was centered around the practice of dealing with dukkha, which is the core practice of Buddhism, really, isn't it? Why do we follow the Buddhist path? Why are we interested to meditate? Why are we interested to do anything to do with Buddhism? Offer dana, keep precepts, listen, study the sutras, listen to the Dhamma, or meditate. So because we have an interest to get beyond dukkha, which is often translated as suffering, sometimes stress, sometimes pain. But the bit of life that we don't like and don't want. You ask anyone in this world, what do you want? Probably the most common answer might be, I want to be happy. I want to be peaceful. Maybe I want to be healthy if they're ill. Maybe I want to have some money if they got no money. But generally, these things are all come under the title of, or the heading of, I want to be happy in one way or another. Material happiness or mental or spiritual happiness. That's what people want. But in order to be happy, we have to understand what is the cause of our suffering and stress, or this dukkha, experience of dukkha. And Ajahn Sumedho and of course Ajahn Chah were very good at explaining that to people, pointing out where it comes from and what they can do about it. Perhaps that's the key. One of the most important things that we got from Ajahn Chah himself, and then later from Lumpur Sumedho, is just the sense of confidence that this practice does work for human beings. The Buddhist teachings still apply. They're still relevant in the modern era, and they can get you from a place where you may be experiencing suffering to a place where maybe you're going beyond suffering, or at least reducing your suffering. And that's important because many of us who come from non-Buddhist backgrounds, or even people from Buddhist backgrounds but haven't really practiced that much, have a basic faith but haven't meditated, we often have doubt, skepticism, uncertainty about the practice, whether it's really worth it, about ourselves, whether we can really do it. So if you meet teachers who display a certain peace and confidence in what they've practiced and then pass that on in teachings, that helps us. And particularly in places where there aren't many teachers. So in the old days in the UK, there were very few Buddhist monasteries and teachers. So people appreciate the role Luang Por Sumedho played in pulling the community along, teaching, guiding, supporting the community. And the same in Thailand for Luang Por Chah. If you know the life story of Luang Por Chah, if you've read his biography or if you've heard teachings, and Luang Por Chah also began in very humble beginnings in Ubon, northeast Thailand. In very little education, just finished his primary education, didn't go to high school. Came from a poor farming family, but because he had a sincerity of interest to practice what the Buddha taught, he became a Buddhist monk. Studied for a number of years and then went off on what we call tudong, wandering in the forests of Thailand, which back in the 1930s were riddled with malaria and other life-threatening diseases, full of wild animals, full of people who didn't have that much faith in Buddhism and wouldn't necessarily support Buddhist monks. So he also had to go through his own trials and challenges as a young monk. Sometimes Ajahn Chah himself would say, this Dhamma that I teach you, that later would inspire monks like myself or Ajahn Sumedho, he said, this Dhamma that I teach you has come from sacrifice, from really giving up to the practice. And he would say occasionally, not in a boastful way or showing off, but he'd say sometimes in a very matter-of-fact way that sometimes I had to put my life on the line to realize the Dhamma, risk my life, and also to bring that Dhamma that I've realized and understood for you to practice. He might tell the monks that because he did almost die a number of times in the forests of Thailand. In those days he had malaria and had no real medicine to deal with it. So he was very weak from malaria on a number of occasions and just had simple herbal remedies from the forest to deal with it. He had to encounter other kinds of illness. He had to encounter wild animals. So he really did have to give up a lot of comfort, security, in order to pursue the practice of Dhamma in those days, to learn how to meditate, to learn how to tame his mind, you might say. But then out of compassion, he came back and he taught us. And even now, all these years after Luang Por Chah has passed away, we still have Luang Por Sumedho to inspire us. But the teachings of Ajahn Chah are still very valuable, contained in books and on tape, in recordings. And then of course the living teaching, as it were, in his monasteries around the world, in Thailand and around the world. And sometimes they say, if you want to know Ajahn Chah, you look at his monks, you look at his monasteries. And the monasteries of Ajahn Chah are growing in number, the Sangha is growing, and they're still very suitable places to practice. Of course, every monastery is a little bit different, but there's a certain similarity and there's a certain unification or unified way of practice that you find throughout Ajahn Chah's monasteries that's still there. And it links right back to the way he taught and practiced. So Luang Por Sumedho is considered to be a great proponent and a great example of somebody who took on Ajahn Chah's teachings and, you might say, gave up to them, just as Ajahn Chah gave up to his teachers and to the Buddha Dhamma Sangha. Ajahn Sumedho gave up to Ajahn Chah and the Buddha Dhamma Sangha. And that's really one of the keys to why people get on in their practice, why they survive as monastics, why they find true peace, true insight, is because they don't quit, they don't give up. There's a sincerity of effort and interest to learn the Dhamma and understand where does dukkha or suffering come from, and then to apply the remedy, the practice for overcoming dukkha. You can't really be successful in the Buddhist path by doing it kind of half-heartedly or casually. It doesn't really work. You can call yourself a Buddhist, of course, but if you're not putting the principles of practice into practice, in your daily life, then nothing much is going to change, I don't think. It's one of the insights most people get as the longer you've been practicing Buddhism, you realize you really have to put these teachings to the test through the practice. It's not just a belief system, I believe the Buddha was enlightened, I believe the Buddha's teachings are true. And that may be your starting point, but it's not enough to change your own mind, your own experience of stress and suffering and remove it. You have to actually apply the teachings. And Ajahn Chah was very good at getting people to do that, but in a very natural way. You can't force anyone to practice the Dhamma, practice these teachings, but you can lead by example and also by pointing out, you might say, where they're going wrong in their thinking and where they need to change their approach perhaps. And both Luang Por Sumedho and Luang Por Chah are much loved by their students for the way they were good at just prompting people and nudging people and getting them to practice and getting them to look at their practice from different angles. They're quite creative. One thing Luang Por Dhamma, the other senior monk living in England, said is that when he first went to live with Ajahn Chah, he had come through one of the Vipassana monasteries in Bangkok, if I remember right. And he'd, like many of us, he'd done what we call Vipassana retreats as a layman. So in those days it wasn't the more commonly known Goenka retreats, which are now, people practice Goenka-style Vipassana retreats all over the world. In those days it was the Mahasi Sayadaw retreats. And myself and many other monks, before we were monks, we practiced them. The Burmese method, you might say, learning to develop insight, noting, contemplating impermanence in every movement, in every sensation. Ajahn Kalyano had practiced that, and then he went to stay with Ajahn Chah and told Ajahn Chah how he practiced and said, is it okay if I keep practicing that here with you? And Ajahn Chah didn't enforce any kind of special method on his new students. In that case, he said, oh yeah, it's okay, you keep practicing that. And Ajahn Chah explained that, if you go to someone's house and you see a fruit basket on their dining table, there'll be many kinds of fruit in the basket. There's apples, oranges, bananas, whatever. It's all fruit, but there are many kinds of fruit, and they can all stay together in the same basket. And the approach we have to meditation can be like that. People have their different backgrounds. Ajahn Kalyano had the Mahasi Sayadaw background, and that was similar for me when I first went on retreat, or first joined the monastery in Thailand. That was my background. I'd done a Mahasi Sayadaw retreat, read his books, and that was how I practiced. And Ajahn Chah and his disciples, tend to be very open and accepting that, you may have different backgrounds, so you bring your way of practice with you, as long as it conforms with the general principles of the Noble Eightfold Path, the Dhamma, the Vinaya. Obviously in a monastery we have a lot of rules of training based on the Vinaya that the Buddha taught, the code of discipline. So you have to follow that, there's no way around that, you have to keep the rules. But within that, there's still a room for different approaches to meditation, different reflections, and different ways of practice. And Ajahn Chah was very open, very compassionate, and accepted people from their different backgrounds, like different fruits in the basket. We can all live in the same monastery, and one monk may be doing his vipassana, and one monk is doing his samatha, developing samadhi. One monk is meditating on the theme of loving kindness, one monk is doing his breath meditation, one monk is doing his body contemplation. Ajahn Chah wouldn't enforce his view or his method, in inverted commas, on new meditators, new practitioners. He said, try it and see how we go. And then if they had questions, they go and ask him, and he would give advice and support. But he'd also he'd give people the respect to practice and learn for themselves and find their own way, depending on their own character and their own background. I think Ajahn Sumedho appreciated that when he went to live with Ajahn Chah, and then many of us afterwards too. Because we all do come from different backgrounds. We come from different parents, different countries and cultures, even languages, and so on. You can't expect everyone to be exactly the same, every practitioner to do their meditation exactly the same way. Our bodies are different, our physical way is different for each person. But you have certain guidelines and, you might say, obligations when you come into a monastery. You do have to follow the certain rules or come to the meetings when there's a group meeting and so on. But within that, there's also the freedom to experiment and try things. There's one thing that foreign monks who are attracted to, that attracted foreign monks to Lumpur Sumedho later, but also Lumpur Cha, is that he didn't forbid or stop anyone trying different things as long as they thought if whatever they were doing fell within the boundaries of Dhamma Vinaya. So people would try different meditation objects. Say, for example, Ajahn Chah, if he taught a meditation word to recite to help people just calm their mind and bring up mindfulness, he would usually teach Buddho, the word Buddho from Buddha. That's what Ajahn Mun taught, that's what Ajahn Chah taught. But he didn't say you can't try another word if there's another word that works for you. So one monk I know said, well, I find these Pali words of the Buddha a little difficult. Can I use a word in English, like letting go? And he said, yeah, you can do that. So instead of reciting Buddho, the monk would meditate reciting let go, let go, let go, which worked for him because it has a good meaning, let go, as opposed to cling on and hold on. And when you're meditating, that is a kind of a mechanism for helping you to let go of all kinds of states of stress, suffering, negativity, sleepiness, worry, anger, greed, desire, and so on. Ultimately you're letting go of things. So that monk found it a very simple but effective way to train his mind in the beginning to let go by reciting the word let go. Ajahn Chah didn't prevent that or stop that, so he's very grateful to Ajahn Chah for his broad-mindedness. Some monks would take other words or phrases, sometimes in Pali, the language of the Buddha, sometimes in English or their language, depending where they came from in the world. And Ajahn Chah said, fine, the language is not important, it's more what you're pointing to, isn't it? You're pointing to your own heart, your own mind, and getting to know that, and getting to know the phenomena, the experiences that are arising, and getting them to see them in the light of the way things are, that every thought you have is impermanent. It's just a simple truth, but we miss it all the time, and that's why we suffer, because when you don't see impermanence or change, you tend to grasp onto things as solid, as me. You identify with them as me, myself, and you give a lot of importance to them. So another monk I know, he took on the practice, became a monk, was meditating, and his practice was he would use the reflection on impermanence as his main meditation object. So he'd use the Pali word. Instead of saying letting go, he'd say anicca, which means impermanence. You probably heard the phrase sabbe sankhara anicca. all conditions are impermanent, all conditions are subject to change. Whatever arises must pass away. So whether it's physical phenomena, this body, the sensations in the body, or the world around us, or mental phenomena, thoughts, feelings, memories. Everything he would bring up this reflection, anicca, 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 anicca. It's impermanent, it's not sure. Ajahn Chah would use the word not sure, but this monk used the word anicca because he felt it linked him back to the Buddha. It's a word from the Buddha, anicca. So he'd recite that every day. He went off to stay in a cave. In Thailand they have quite a lot of caves where you can meditate and practice as a monk. And in this cave he was meditating every day. He'd walk and he'd recite anicca. He'd sit, he'd recite anicca. When he's eating his meal, anicca. And he'd contemplate the changing phenomena arising in his mind and in the world around him. So eating his food, he'd contemplate impermanence. One bite, you swallow one mouthful, then another. You finish your meal. Every meal has a beginning, has an end. It's impermanent. Then you go and wash your bowl, and you throw away the rice grains, and then little creatures come and eat them, and they're gone. They're impermanent. And you put your bowl away. Then you go and do something else. You walk meditation up, back and forth in the sun to warm up, maybe if it's cold weather. Then the sun goes behind a cloud, it's impermanent. You walk one pace, it's impermanent. You see something and it's impermanent. Even walking back and forth in the forest, what you see is always changing, isn't it? So it's impermanent, it's anicca. And he said at first he thought, oh, this is too simple, this is not going to work, there must be something better. But walking back and forth, reciting anicca, 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 and then doing his sitting meditation, reciting anicca, anicca. In the end, he said his mind converged into a state of samadhi. He said this is after many months of practicing, and he had this beautiful, blissful state of mind, and he just sort of sat with it for many hours, and his whole feeling of his body and mind changed that day that he had this blissful experience. As one of the benefits when you do practice samadhi and attain a bit of samadhi, the peace, the happiness lasts. It's better than what you might call sensual happiness, of eating nice food or any kind of sensual experience, watching a movie, listening to music, sex, whatever it is that you associate with sensual happiness. All of that is very passing, very fleeting. But the day this monk, I know, he meditated, and by contemplating impermanence, his mind gathered together and let go of everything. It became very still, one-pointed, and that happiness lasted all day. He said better than any other kind of happiness he'd experienced in his life. It was the fruit of a lot of patient effort, of course, but when it happened, he could see, this is a very peaceful state of mind, very different than anything he'd experienced before. And it came through reciting the word anicca, which means impermanence. So Ajahn Chah was very good at getting people to try things and see what worked for them. Another monk, Ajahn Chah taught him to practice mindfulness of breathing, but he found it difficult to stay with the breath. His mind was all over the place, thinking a lot, worrying, thinking about home, thinking about the future, thinking about the past. So he decided to contemplate the theme of death, maranam, or marananusati, which is quite a common contemplation for Buddhist monks. It doesn't sound very attractive just to think of death, but it has a very powerful meaning to the mind. You think of death, it makes you think of, when you die, there's nothing left. There's nothing left to cling to, there's nothing left to think about, worry about, desire, because you're dead. Sounds obvious, but if you take it up as a meditation theme, it can be quite effective for cutting through all kinds of mental proliferation, anxiety, worry, because Whatever you're worried about will end when you die. You won't have to worry about all those health issues that you've got coming up, and paying bills, and that person who doesn't like you and what they think of you. It doesn't matter when you die, does it? So it's a very good way, very powerful way to cut through all kinds of moods and mental proliferation that we identify with and attach to. So Ajahn Chah didn't stop him. He said, if you find contemplating death as a meditation object, in a deliberate way, a sincere way, helps your mind to calm down, settle down and let go, well, why not? If it brings you peace, why not? In the end, any meditation we do, the purpose is to bring us a sense of physical and mental well-being, peace, relax us a bit, at least more than before. We may not be fully enlightened yet, but at least you feel more at peace than you did before you did the meditation. That's the aim. So this monk did it, and again, he got very peaceful contemplating death. It's quite hard to explain that to someone who's never done it, especially someone who's never meditated, maybe never heard Buddhist teachings. They think, you sound like you're kind of crazy, or you're doing something weird. Why would you think about death? That sounds so depressing. That's because if you've never done it before, well, you're only comparing it to your normal way of thinking, where you think, I want to be happy and full of life and full of passions and etc., etc. Well, of course, that's the normal way a human being thinks, isn't it? But if you have heard some of the Buddhist teachings and you're interested in taming your mind, pacifying your mind, maybe it's worth a go. You try it. You don't actually have to do anything that risks your life. It's not like you have to go to contemplate death. You have to go somewhere where you're at risk of dying. You simply bring up the concept, the idea of death, in whatever way works for you. So most people who contemplate death, they begin by thinking it through. Maybe thinking through, reflecting on suttas or teachings they've heard from a living teacher, or maybe a sutta, the words of the Buddha. Contemplating the idea of death first, just thinking it through. What does death mean? If I died tomorrow or today, what would it mean? It means this physical body stops. I won't see anybody that I've been seeing, the family, friends, people I know, I won't see them again. The places that I know, I won't see them again. All the experiences I've had up till now in my life will finish, will end, both good and bad ones. Everything will change with death. You just think it through in the beginning. Reason with yourself, bring up some wise reflection. And really, it's not a bad practice to do for anyone, whether you're meditating or not, because one day we will die. And we always get upset when some other people die, the people we attach to, our family, friends. When they die, we experience grief, sadness, which can be very overwhelming and last a long time. But quite often we forget to reflect, but I'm also going to die. And many times people would come to teachers like Ajahn Chah, and they're crying and sad because their loved one has passed away. Maybe the first thing you say is, you are also going to die, just as your mother or grandparent who has died, you will also die. Have you thought about that? That's the truth, isn't it? We all are subject to death. None of us live forever. So it's a very powerful thought and a powerful meditation object. So first of all, you just think it through. What does it mean to you, the fact that you will die? How do you want to die, maybe? Do you want to die with a peaceful mind, or a mind that's full of anger or regret or worry, fear? So it brings up many further subsequent reflections. So it brings up both some wisdom, but also maybe more questions. But that's okay, you can question, what is death and how will I approach my death? How do I want to do it? How do I want to be whenever the time comes? And of course you don't know when you're going to die, so that's another part of it. It's uncertain, it's not sure. Could be tomorrow, could be in 20, 30, 40 years' time, who knows. But it will happen, so you use the certainty of death as a reflection. Once you've thought it through, you contemplated it, sort of understood it as a theme, just as an idea, then maybe you pick one aspect of death in a word, usually a word such as death or maranang, or death is certain, and maranang me niyatang, in Pali, in English, or in your own language. You pick one aspect that you can then just focus on, maybe recite the word or the phrase. Some people are more visual, so occasionally they take the visual image of themselves as a corpse. Look at yourself in your mind's eye. When I die, what will I look like? Not going to look at my best. And even on this last visit to England, Ajahn Sumedho, when the monks were bowing to him, he said, "You are just bowing to a corpse," because that's what a human body is. And the older you get, the more obvious that becomes. Because as we get older, we get wrinkled, white hair, bones get all bent over, our teeth drop out, our eyes go, our ears go. You become more and more like a corpse the older you get. So Ajahn Sumedho was saying that, you're just bowing to a corpse here. And everyone laughed because they knew what he was doing. He's just pointing to the truth. But that's something you can do even if you're visually minded. You can visualize yourself as a corpse and just focus on that as a meditation. That's what I'll look like one day, a corpse lying on the ground or on a bed or wherever. Or you can recite the word and you use it as a meditation. Do it over and over again, letting go of all the worries about the future, the regrets about the past, the this, the that, all the stuff that fills your mind. It can help you to get a new perspective on it, and you realize, it doesn't matter so much. One of the ones I use, one of the reflections I use, if I was to die today, how do I want my mind to be? Do I want to die with a mind that's all over the place, suffering, stressed? Well, no, I don't. Myself, I believe in karma and rebirth. I know some people don't, but if you do, or if you think at least it might be possible, you don't want to die with a mind that's all over the place, because then you'll be born all over the place. Literally, your consciousness will shoot into some strange place that you didn't want to go and be born there, and you don't want that. So, better to have a mind that's more under your control. Bring up the mindfulness, the insight, and let go particularly of all those negative thoughts that you've been carrying around, the bad moods, the anger, the hatred, the fears and anxieties about this and that, all the doubts and skepticism about life, all the things that stir your mind up. You don't want to die with that bothering you, do you? All the attachments, all the stuff that you attach to, that you want in life, or your pet likes and pet hates. You don't want that filling your mind on the day you die. So don't do it. Reflect. When you die, you want to let go of all of that, put it all down, and just come back to something very simple that brings your mind to the present moment. That's why the breath is so useful. The last thing you let go of when you die really is your breath. But whether you're mindful of that or not, that depends whether you've practiced and trained. Or if it's not the breath, maybe a very wholesome, skillful thought. You could think of the Buddha, and the Buddha did encourage that. He said, if you're close to death, because you never know when it's going to happen, if you're caught unawares, you're close to death, you're afraid, you're nervous, you're worried, think of the Buddha. If you're in the forest and the tiger is charging down on you, or you're in hospital and the doctor says, I've got bad news for you, or you're in a car accident or whatever, if it seems like your last moment, think of the Buddha. If nothing else, think of the Buddha, because the Buddha is a very powerful thought to hold in mind, whether you just recite the name of the Buddha, Buddha or Buddho, or maybe reflect on the qualities of the Buddha, the peace, the compassion, the wisdom of the Buddha. Either just reflect on those qualities or recite the word, Iti piso bhagava arahang samma sambuddho. There's many ways you can recollect the Buddha. Again, you could visualize a Buddha, but you hold your attention on that thought at the end of your life. And the Buddha said, that can be a very powerful way to stabilize your mind, pacify your mind, what you would imagine would be quite a difficult time. Nobody wants to die, so it will bring up all kinds of emotions, but you think of the Buddha and it calms you down. And people I know have done that as they were dying and found it did bring them great peace, calm in their last moments. You could similarly think of the Dhamma, the Sangha, or any other of the wholesome kind of ideas, concepts that appeal to you, that resonate with you. Could be you recollect the dana, the generosity you've practiced, the compassion you practice. Maybe you've helped somebody or some group of people in your life. Anything that's wholesome, you can focus your mind on that at the end of your life, and that will also help to keep your mind more steady in a better place at the end of your life. So there are many different meditation objects, and Ajahn Chah, he didn't sort of put a stamp down and say, there's this one Ajahn Chah method of practice, has to be like this. Obviously, he taught what the Buddha taught, that what we call the Noble Eightfold Path, Sila Samadhi Panya, Dhamma Vinaya. There is a certain structure and pattern to what he was teaching. But within that, there was quite a lot of creativity as well, because his mind was very wise and very alert to the fact that there are different angles you can look at the Dhamma. There's different ways you can practice. And partly that depends on each individual, doesn't it? Their background, and their personality, their karma, how they are. So Ajahn Sumedho was one example, still is an example of one of Ajahn Chah's students who has stuck it out, practiced the Dhamma very well through his life. He's 90 years old, still alive today. And we're very happy that he is. And something that I've just reflected on the last few weeks, because I went to visit him and shared that with you tonight. So if any of these reflections are useful in your practice, then I leave them with you.